were all doing different things. But, I mean, what was the most common activities? What were the most common activities that they were involved in?
The clear answer to this is actually just simply conversations. So 99.5% of volunteers had conversations with family and friends. 98.3% had them with strangers, and that was in the real world. And in the virtual world, 85% of volunteers had conversations with family and friends, and 81.9% with strangers. And I think what's remarkable about that is that if you think about the classic things you're not allowed to discuss in pubs. Don't talk about no football and no politics. But this was a time where people really got into great discussions and felt confident and educated to do that. That it was a national conversation. Whereas you see the political campaigns as we're going through it at the moment, and of course canvassing is important, and people do knock the doors, but it's nowhere near to the extent the Yes campaign or the typical political campaigning, the kind of leafleting or maybe a hustings. But this was conversation, so I think that was fascinating. I think the other side, and we would all be able to point to examples of visual support for the campaign. So 96.7% said they displayed posters, 95% said they wore branded merchandise. And the importance of that there is this self-declaration that I'm not scared to be seen as one of this group. And the other side, from the campaign, from a marketing perspective, what it did is it was allow the rest of Scotland who weren't wearing those badges to see people like them wearing those badges and declaring for Yes. So it wasn't something for an odd bunch of people, for just for ginger-haired Scotsmen, just for it just made it normalised Yes by having these posters up, and it gave people support when you were getting so much negativity thrown through the mainstream media. And one of the reasons that the mainstream media do these things is to try and demoralise the enemy, so that there is no hope. So why are you continuing to go on? So to have this clear visual expression of being part of the campaign, I think was very important to maintain morale and to foster that excitement that we certainly saw in the last 6 weeks.
Yeah, you just made me think. An interesting point would be how many people are still wearing all their Yes stuff and badge. I've still got my Yes badge on my bag, and
Same here. Yeah. Yes. No. That would be interesting to find out. What we're now 18 months on. We certainly still see lots of Leith Says I T-shirts hanging around and looking well worn by now. But who are still self-declaring, making that point. I mean, then within the other activities, we did certainly saw lots of traditional political activities such as canvassing, so knocking on doors, asking people's opinions. But the canvassing was also a conversion canvassing, so there was persuasion activities. So that was about 43% of campaigners did that. 63% delivered leaflets frequently or very frequently. And then we did have a very high number of people, 27.8 said they spoke at a public meeting. The way we phrased that question, that could include people who asked questions as well, but at least they felt confident enough to get up at a public meeting. That doesn't necessarily mean that of the 993 people we spoke to, that 250 of them actually spoke as speakers, but they were certainly there, confident enough to have spoken at a meeting. So there was also the very high numbers of people who there was the creativity of it, the people who are making things, making signs, knitting little Yes flowers in one instance, making badges, and all that creativity that we saw. So it was a campaign. When you look at what people did, it was a campaign that had activities for people of all levels of skill and feelings of confidence. If you wanted to be standing up there at a public meeting, people were able to do that. Canvassing, if you were more confident doing, was delivering leaflets. So there was such a broad range of things that people were able to do in order to get involved.
And during the campaign, there was people making things physically, but there was also a large explosion in sort of digital content, apart from, writing blogs or making podcasts or various other things. I remember all the little images that people photoshopped and made up, and there was hundreds of new places to go to find online content. How many people were doing that?
We didn't find, we didn't measure down to the level of the sort of activities you were talking about there, but we certainly found well over 80% of people reading email briefings from Yes Scotland, and well over 70% of people joining a Facebook page aligned to Yes. We saw significant numbers of people joining Facebook pages aligned to No as well, just to keep an eye on what the other people were doing. There was 70% of people posting on Facebook and taking part in the online debate as well with a conversation. So we found high levels of digital engagement. We didn't get figures. We didn't ask that question about who was starting the blogs, for example.
And at the risk of offending a couple of people, did you have a question about how many people screamed, "For God's sake, get your act together," after reading official Yes Scotland emails?
I think one of the things that we do see right down, we did ask quite a number of questions about their assessment of the campaign. So, was it well run, for example? And one of the things we certainly saw was that there was a significantly high levels of satisfaction with the local campaigns, and they were run. And they thought they were effective than with Yes Scotland. So Yes Scotland was still seen as effective, and it was well run, but the figures were significantly lower than those for the local groups.
There was some dissatisfaction with the official campaign.
No, they were still positive. It just wasn't quite as high.
Okay.
I think that's important. So the Yes Scotland was still well over the mean point. So it was a 5-point scale. So anything over 2.5 is positive, and they were at 3.6, for example, for their how effective they were. Whereas the local campaigns were up at 4.3. So people were really positive about their local groups that they were part of. And there's got to be some sort of motivated reasoning. If we were asking people who were involved in local campaigns how good their local campaigns were, of course they're going to say they were good. one would expect. But I think the premise of your question there about some of the frustration with the lack of resources that Yes Scotland had, for example, certainly came through.
Okay, so we looked at the who and the what. Let's move on to the why. You said you spoke to just about 1,000 people. What were the main reasons they gave for getting involved in the campaign?
One of the reasons it took me so long to get this survey analysed and sent out was because of these questions. Because we asked people in an open text format at the start, why did you get involved? And typically with surveys, you get either nothing in these boxes or you get a couple of words. People were writing up to sort of 250, 300 words, significant short essays about why they got involved. They were so excited to tell you about all the different factors that were coming through. And it just took me so long to code all of those and to get down the multiple answers that were in there. So the first set of reasons that I'll give you come from this open-ended question. What motivated you to become involved? And they can have multiple answers. There very much was the opportunity. They'd been waiting for this opportunity for a referendum. They'd been long-term believers, so 43.4% had been waiting for this opportunity to come along. There was very much, they had to do something now. That was part of it, 34.5. They didn't want to regret. I think that was a really important one. The notion of getting involved because we didn't want to regret not getting involved. And that's a common reason when we look at motivational research. Then we get down into some of the specifics of the messages that come from the campaign. That 28% of people said because they were against Westminster system, the oppression, they were against the way that the UK was being run. So there was the hope of an independent Scotland to get away from that fear-driven or that negative symbol. Just under 20% of people saying it was all about it was a democracy and self-government. Social justice got 12.4%. 11.4% said they got involved because of the inclusive and exciting nature of the campaign. 10% because it was of the fairness. Maybe just being a bit cheeky, but one of the things I think is particularly interesting here is 11.8% said they got involved because of media bias or Better Together's negativity. So that there was a recruiting sergeant element for that, for the relentless negativity. And we did certainly see this with people who had been undecided, were driven across not only to voting yes, but also volunteering, because once they thought, hang on, once they started to question what the media was saying, Then they started questioning the establishment. Then they were able to question the whole notion of the UK. And as one woman in this section, this open-ended section, said, it was like having the scales removed from my eyes. And she went on to campaign very heavily. And within that figure of the 11.8%, the BBC were mentioned by just under 5% of people specifically as a reason for getting involved. So we see that as the long-term belief in independence, but then some of the civic nationalist ideas of democracy, social justice, fairness, very much coming through from there. And that we saw some really interesting open text ones. It was a 47-year-old woman who had never been a member of a political party. It was something I had to do. Independence is about standing on your own 2 feet. If you aren't prepared to campaign for that, then you're not really prepared for what it means. So we had some wonderful comments of a 52-year-old man, never a new party member, was never interested in politics until I became aware how badly Scotland was mismanaged and the people lied to. So we got a lot of emotion coming through from there. I've always believed in the principle of self-determination with regard to Scottish governments, but the main rationale was the possibility of a platform for a new democratic form of politics and a transformed political economy, one with genuine global reach and challenging the hegemony of neoliberalisation in the world system. And then in brackets, honestly, which I thought that was a fantastic quote, but demonstrates demonstrates some of the range of reasons and the emotional excitement and the opportunity that the campaign provided.
I'm sure there was a lot of really excellent and well thought out pieces in there, but there must have been a couple of funny one-liners as well. I mean, on certain days, if you asked me why I could support Scottish independence, I could just answer, look, Jeff Hoon, or something like that. You know, I mean, you must have had a couple of one-liners in there, I'm sure.
There were lots of them that just said, I believe in independence. You know, there was lots of that. There was only, I think, and this is one I thought again was interesting. There was only one that was specifically anti-English. Of the 993 that we looked at, only one of them in any way could be categorised as specifically anti-English. No, I didn't get too much humour. I'm just looking back through the thing. I didn't see too many specifically humorous ones. There were ones to build a better country for my 3 grandchildren in Scotland and build a better world for grandchildren everywhere. There was a lot of earnest ones in here, but a lot of other ones that were just straight to the point. I want independence. I believe in independence and always have.
Also, from some of those things you were reading there, it seems like some of those people were new to politics. But during the campaign, we also saw other sort of more hardened or seasoned campaigning groups like CND and things, Scottish CND, that were involved with it and then moved on to the Yes side. So what was the kind of split between independents who got involved for the first time in a political campaign and, more sort of seasoned campaigners who'd been around for a long time?
It's very difficult, and we spent a lot of time trying to work out how to ask that question, because what is your first entry into political campaigning? Is it looking after delivering one leaflet 30 years ago, or one bundle in leaflets 30 years ago, and then not doing anything in the intervening time? Does that mean you've been involved for 30 years? Or is it helping out the local park, etc.? So that was a difficult question to ask. So what we did find, though, was when we looked to see when people first volunteered to become part of the Yes campaign, a quarter of those people saw themselves as they had been part of the Yes campaign before it started. So I think that captured those people who'd been independent supporters for a number of years, and then we saw gradual increases every 3 months up until July. The people who did volunteer were absolutely serial volunteers. They tended also to be so nearly 60% were members of trade unions, nearly 50% were members of sports and recreation clubs, nearly 50% members of professional associations. So they were the sort of people who did other things as well in their lives. We also found that they were members of more than one activity. So there wasn't this I just do Yes Scotland or I just did National Collective. They were members of all of those. They might have done most of their campaigning in Yes or RIC, but also within National Collective. So 72% saw themselves as a member of a local Yes group. Nearly 40% had been active in RIC, and that can mean that they've just turned up to one or two of their mass canvasses, handed out a couple of their leaflets, saying nearly 2/3 of women were active within Women for Independence. So I think what we've captured here is people who were long-term supporters, but also a majority of people who had